With the simple steps I'll show you in this video, you can create peeling paint for your own abandoned miniatures. I picked up this book box at my local Goodwill for $4, and I'll start by painting the walls. I'm mixing some brown acrylic paint into white, but I'm not mixing it all the way because I want it to leave streaks as I paint it. When creating abandoned miniatures, it's really important to layer some textures to create a realistic look. This streaky paint will serve as a base layer. In a future video, I'll accessorize this space to look like a 1950s abandoned lab. To create another layer of interest, I'm using some watered down black paint on an old toothbrush to create the look of mold. This technique can take a little bit of practice, but it's really simple. I just dip the bristles of the toothbrush into the watered down paint and use my thumb to pull the bristles back so it'll splatter. I'll eventually be creating a collapsed ceiling in this corner, so I'm concentrating some mold there. For the sake of realism, I don't want to cover the entire walls with mildew and mold, but just in a few areas. I'm also careful not to create a pattern like adding the splatter into every corner because that looks less realistic. For creating abandoned miniatures, this liquid latex is my secret weapon. Liquid latex is used in special effects makeup to create scars and different skin textures. For this project, I'm adding some areas of liquid latex using a paintbrush. Using a combination of painting the latex and splattering it on, I'm adding it mostly to the areas I added mold. While adding the liquid latex, I'm concentrating on making it look natural and organic. For some references, I googled water-damaged walls and peeling paint to get some ideas. While adding the liquid latex, I tap it on rather than painting it so it'll be thick enough to peel later when it dries. I'm adding some extra liquid latex to this corner that will have extensive water damage. I bought my liquid latex on Amazon for $10, but you can use other brands or buy it locally as well. I'll leave more information in the description below. About 10 minutes later, the thinnest areas are dry and the thicker areas are still partially wet. To make this latex look like peeling paint, I'm using my fingertip to slightly roll up some of the wet latex and pull some other strings down. I've only ever seen people creating their peeling paint effect after the latex has completely dried, but I prefer this method. Manipulating the latex as it's drying creates much more dynamic textures than waiting for it to completely dry. Now the latex is completely dry and I'm using some natural sea sponges from the Dollar Tree to add a second layer of paint. For this second coat of paint, I'm using a combination of beige, brown, and white. I'm adding the color with one sponge without cleaning it between colors, and then I use a clean, damp sponge to diffuse the colors. I use the second sponge without any paint on it to break up any patterns the first sponge created, and then I rinse it out between uses. It's really important that I make sure all of the liquid latex I added is covered in a layer of paint. If I don't add any paint to the latex, it'll look completely unrealistic, and if I add paint that's too thin, it won't give the correct effect. I'm making sure to add the paint thickly or even in 2 or 3 layers. It's easy to tell if the paint you added was too thin because it'll flake off of the latex later when you try to peel it. Peeling the latex is so satisfying. I'm gently pulling it up to disturb it without completely removing it. Some people like to use tweezers to grab hold of the latex, and you can also use your finger to roll it back and forth. The combination of methods of disturbing the latex as it dries and rolling it around and peeling it off after it has dried makes a really convincing effect. This is an area of liquid latex I painted on and allowed to dry completely. To create a paint bubble in a large area of peeling paint, I'm using my thumb to lift the latex by rubbing it back and forth gently. I like to lift the latex to create large sections of peeling paint, but then I use a small amount of glue to secure the ends so they don't get torn off. For some added depth, which contributes to the realism, I'm adding some chalk pastels. I'm using the chalk pastels to create some shadows and also emphasizing some of the peeling paint. This step is actually more effective after you've already added your furniture and accessories so you can age them in place. For example, if you add a clock to the wall, you could drop a shadow under it using your pastels. This space doesn't have any, but I also like to add shadows around windows and door frames. Now I'm using a clean, damp sea sponge to dial back some of the intensity. You could also use a damp paper towel for this, but I got this sea sponge at the Dollar Tree in the bath section for $1. This next technique is second only to liquid latex when it comes to aging your walls. I created a really simple wash using acrylic paint and water, and now I'm using my brush to add it to the walls. This technique is really easy and it imitates the look of years of age and grime. I don't want it to look like I intentionally dripped paint over these walls, even though that's exactly what I did, so I'm using a damp paper towel to remove some of the paint on the drips. This creates a much more subtle and realistic look. To make sure I don't remove all of the paint, I let it dry for just a minute or so before I gently dab off the excess. To further enhance this look and add another layer of age and grime, I made another wash with a different color. For the second wash color, I didn't remove the excess paint to create more contrast and show you what it looks like. At my local dollhouse store, this 1/12 scale beadboard is usually $4, but I got it for a discount because of a crack. I'm covering the lower half of the wall with this beadboard. I used a 1/12 scale chair as a guide and decided to cut the beadboard 3.5 inches high. I used wood glue and hot glue to attach it. If you don't have access to this, I'll link a video in the description showing how to create wall paneling from cereal box. Next, I'll be modifying this flat trim to create some trim to top the beadboard. To make this trim work, I cut the excess piece off of the bottom and glued 2 layers to the back. Now this trim will reach the wall as well as overhanging the beadboard. The aging techniques I'll be using on this paneling can also be used on pieces of furniture. First, I'm installing some simple wooden floors using skinny sticks from Walmart. I'm cutting the boards at random lengths to make laying the floors go faster. I'm planning my rows 2 or 3 at a time and installing the boards with hot glue. I'm starting by installing the boards at the front of the room. To finish the skinny row across the back, I mark with a pencil, cut with my miter shears, and try to drop it in place. It's too tight of a fit and the underside is getting stuck along the paneling, so I'm using my miter shears to create a 45-degree angle. This wall paneling will have multiple layers and it starts with a coat of stain. I made this stain by diluting brown paint with some rubbing alcohol, but you could also use water. Most of this stain will be covered with paint, but it's a really important first step. I added some of the same color to the floor and covered it with watered down paint, wiping away the excess with a paper towel. I'll finish that once it dries, but now I'll go back to the paneling. I'm painting the paneling with this beautiful blue color, making sure not to achieve full coverage. Allowing some of the brown stain to show through helps make it look old. You could also use crackle medium under your paint for an added effect. I added some liquid latex the same way I added it to the walls, and now I'm covering it with a brown wash. I'm using the wash differently in this technique. Rather than having it look like it's dripping, I'm using it to tone down the blue color and create a layer of grime. To achieve this look, I'm painting it on in a thin, even coat and allowing it to dry. To emphasize the areas of liquid latex, I'm adding a black wash. The black wash settles in the deepest areas of the liquid latex and emphasizes the depth. You could stop at this step, but I wanted the walls to look even older, so I covered the entire thing with a thin black wash, and now I'm using a damp paper towel to buff it away. I removed some of the paint all the way down to the stained wood, which creates a lot of depth and makes it look really old. Now the walls look terrible, which is fantastic, so I'll finish the wooden floors. I'm adding a layer of black wash and allowing it to dry completely to deepen the color on the floors. Once it dried, I gave it a worn look using sandpaper. To create the look of nail holes, I used a sewing needle dipped into some black paint to poke the end of each board. You can check out the Steampunk Diorama video if you'd like to see how I created a completely different looking floor using the same skinny sticks. It's really hard to stop because aging miniatures is so much fun, so I'm using my tweezers to pull a little bit on the latex to reveal some of the blue paint color underneath. Make sure you subscribe if you'd like to see my next video on abandoned miniatures where I show how to create a collapsed ceiling. I'll also be finishing this project, so you don't want to miss out on that. Thank you for watching.